For 34 years, I cut open croaker, reached in behind the gut, pulled out a pail sack the size of a hot dog bun, and dropped it in the barrel. Thousands of them, and nobody ever asked me what it was. That sack, dried and shipped to the right market, has sold for around 140 times what the meat off the same fish sells for. Here is my claim, and I want you to hold me to it. By the end of this, you will know 6 parts of a fish that get thrown away here and what each is actually worth. One of them sits at the center of a wildlife crime economy, and I am going to tell you that plainly rather than sell it to you. 15 items. 2. My trade will not thank me for. Good. Nothing to buy here. Here is number 1. Number 1. The swim bladder. Every bony fish carries one. It is a gas-filled sac lying along the top of the body cavity, just under the spine, and its job is buoyancy. The animal adjusts the gas inside it and hangs at whatever depth it wants without swimming. On a croaker or a drum, it also works as a resonator, which is why those fish make the noise they are named for. When you gut a fish at home, you have almost certainly torn one open without noticing, because it looks like nothing much at all. Pale and thin and roughly the shape of a long balloon that has lost most of its air. Dried, that thing has a name in the trade, which is fish maw, and in Cantonese cooking it sits in the company of abalone and sea cucumber on the short list of ingredients served at a wedding to demonstrate that money was spent. Now the arithmetic. A fishmonger in Belém, in Brazil, described his own numbers to a reporter a few years ago. The flesh of the yellow croaker he handles sells for about 20 reais a kilo, somewhere near $3.50. The dried bladder out of the same animal sells for 2,800 reais, call it $497. That is a factor of roughly 140 between the part he sells and the part he used to throw out. Ordinary dried maw from perfectly legal species retails between $450 and $1,300 a kilogram, depending on species and thickness and size. The price is also still climbing. In French Guiana, where boats catch a fish called a coupe weak fish, fresh bladders were going for 40 to 45 euros a kilo. 5 years later, the same bladders were fetching 170 to 180, and dried they reach 1,000 and more. It takes roughly 30 kilos of fish to produce 1 kilo of bladder, so the boats are not catching more. The value simply moved from the meat to the organ while everybody was looking at the meat. Number 2. Now, the part of this you need to hear before anything else, because I am not going to let you find it out later. At the top of that market, there is a fish called the totoaba. It lives in one place on Earth, the Gulf of California. It grows past 200 pounds, and its bladder is large and thick enough that the Chinese market prizes it above all others. Dried totoaba maw has sold on the black market for somewhere between $20,000 and $80,000 a kilogram. Individual bladders have been valued in the tens of thousands. Mexico banned fishing it in 1975. It has been listed under the International Endangered Species Convention since 1976. Every kilogram moving is a crime, and the trade is run by organized networks that have used the same routes and the same people as drug trafficking. The cost is not only the totoaba. The gillnet set for it also catch a small porpoise called the vaquita, which lives in the same water and nowhere else, and which is down to a number you can count on your hands. That animal is being erased as a side effect of a soup ingredient. So understand what I am doing here. I am telling you what the trade is worth because you are entitled to know what your counter throws away. I am not pointing you at that end of it, and there is no version of this where I explain how anybody gets in. When a discarded part suddenly becomes worth more per gram than gold, what follows is not a business opportunity. It is a poaching economy, and the last time this happened, the fish that supplied the market before the totoaba was fished to the point where nobody can find it anymore. The legal end of this is enormous, and it is where everything else in this video lives. Number 3, the roe, and specifically what happens to it when you cure it. Batarga is the salted, pressed, dried egg sac of a fish, and the fish it is most associated with is the gray mullet, which is about as ordinary an animal as exists in American water. Mullet sells for $3 or $4 a pound where it sells at all, and half the counters in this country do not carry it. The cured roe out of that same fish retails between roughly $120 and $260 a pound in the United States. A 3.5-ounce piece from Sardinia runs around $26, and 5.5 ounces of the Greek version, sealed in beeswax, runs about $50. In Taiwan, where it is called wuyuzi and eaten as a dish in its own right rather than grated over something else, it has gone as high as $30 an ounce, which works out near $500 a pound. Every Mediterranean country that touches saltwater has a name for it, whether that is batarga in Italy, paudargo in France, avgataraho in Greece, or batarik in Egypt. The Italians and the Sardinians who eat the most of it have historically called it poor man's caviar. And I would like to know which poor man they had in mind, because at $200 a pound, it has not been that in a very long time. Run the arithmetic on a single fish. A 3-pound mullet in season carrying a pair of roe sacks cost you maybe $10. Those sacks come out at 5 or 6 ounces fresh and lose water as they cure, so you finish with something near 3 ounces of batarga. At the prices I just gave you, that is $40 to $75 of product sitting inside a $10 fish, and it is being scraped into a bucket at counters on both coasts as I speak. Number 4, and this is the one on this entire list you can actually do yourself this week with nothing you do not already own. Getting the sac out whole is the only part requiring any care at all, because the membrane holding the eggs together is thin, and once it tears, you have loose roe rather than batarga. Open the belly gently, work a finger around, and lift the pair out with the connecting tissue intact. Then it gets massaged, which sounds like a flourish and is not. Hold the sac flat between your palms and work from the closed end toward the open one steadily to push out the air bubbles trapped between the eggs, because if you skip it, you get hollow pockets in the finished piece that go rancid well before the rest of it is ready. The salt comes next. Bury the sacs completely in coarse salt in a non-reactive dish, lay a board or a plate on top with a modest weight, and put the whole arrangement in the refrigerator. The salt pulls water out while the weight presses the sac into a flat, dense slab instead of a lumpy one. 2 weeks is typical, more for a large pair, and you will pour off liquid and replace the salt at least once. Then it hangs to dry. Brush off the salt, tie a string through the narrow end, and hang it somewhere cool with moving air for another 2 to 4 weeks, until it firms up to about the resistance of a hard cheese. Some producers dip it in beeswax at that point to hold it. A vacuum bag does the same job. What you have then keeps for a year refrigerated, and you use it the way you use a truffle, sparingly and grated over things that need salt and depth. Which brings me to my own part in this. I sold mullet with the roe still inside it for 34 years and never once charged a cent for that roe, because on my price list it did not exist. The gap between the two ends of that fish is not as violent as the 140 times I opened with, but it is a great deal larger than anybody standing at my glass ever suspected. Number 5, the monkfish liver. A monkfish is an ugly animal by any standard, mostly head and mostly mouth, and what gets sold off it in this country is the tail, firm and white, and sometimes called poor man's lobster. That is the entire retail proposition. Inside that head end sits a liver that runs over half a foot long and comes in past a pound. On a fish where the saleable tail might be 4 or 5 pounds, You are looking at an organ that is a fifth of the marketable weight, and for generations the men catching them dropped it over the side before the boat came in. In Japan it is called ankimo, and it is one of the named delicacies of that cuisine. The comparison everybody reaches for is foie gras, and it is a fair one for texture, even if the flavor is lighter and cleaner than a duck liver. It sits at number 32 on the list CNN put together of the 50 best foods in the world. In an American sushi restaurant with tablecloths, you will pay upward of $10 for 2 or 3 slices, which is the same kind of multiple as the bladder, even if it never reaches 140 times. Now, the part that ought to stop you, and I would ask you to sit with it for a second rather than let it pass. The largest buyer and seller of raw monkfish liver in the United States says openly that the majority of its raw product is exported to Japan. The livers come out of monkfish caught off New England, they get bought by an American company, and then they leave the country because the market for them is somewhere else. Meanwhile, Japanese buyers pay roughly double for American liver over Chinese liver on freshness. So the organ is worth more, moves further, and earns better than most of what stays here, and the only reason it goes is that nobody standing at an American counter asks for it. Number 6, cooking it, which is easier than the price suggests and harder than it sounds. The one genuinely difficult step is the vessels. A monkfish liver is threaded through with blood vessels and connective tissue, and all of it has to come out or the finished piece tastes metallic and gamey. Work over it with the point of a small sharp knife and your fingers opening the liver where you need to and pulling the vessels free. It is very soft and it will start coming apart on you, which is normal and does not matter because you are about to roll it anyway. Then salt it fairly generously all over and leave it 20 minutes, during which a surprising amount of water will come out of it. Pour that off and pat the liver dry. The steak comes next, and you are washing the surface rather than marinating it, so 1/3 of a cup is plenty, poured over and drained away. What it carries off is the last of the iron smell. Then it gets rolled. Lay the liver along a sheet of foil, roll the foil into a tight cylinder, and twist both ends closed like a sweet wrapper, squeezing as you twist so the log firms up and the pieces knit together. Steam that for about half an hour, then chill it thoroughly in the refrigerator before you unwrap it. Slice it cold, about 1/4 inch, and serve it with ponzu, some grated daikon with chili in it, and thin scallion. There is one rule at the table, and it matters more than any of the preparation. Do not put soy sauce anywhere near it. Soy will flatten the whole thing, which is the reason acid is used instead, and it is also the mistake most people make the first time they meet it. The fishermen who first cooked this were not chasing luxury. They were on boats where nothing edible went over the side twice, and they had a liver the size of a forearm and no reason to waste it. Number 7, cod tongues, which are not tongues. The name is wrong, and it has always been wrong. What gets sold under it is a small wedge of muscle from the underside of the throat behind the jaw where the head joins the body. 2 of them per fish, each about the size of the top joint of your thumb, a little gelatinous around the edges and firm through the middle. They eat like scallops, not exactly, but close enough that the comparison is the first thing everybody reaches for after the first bite, and close enough that if somebody put a plate of them in front of you without explanation, you would probably guess shellfish. The history is why they belong on this list rather than one of the more obviously luxurious things. In Newfoundland, when the cod were still there, nobody in the trade bothered with them. The heads came off, went into a pile, and the pile went wherever piles went. What happened instead was that children worked those piles, going through the discarded heads with a small knife, cutting out the 2 tongues from each one and selling them for pocket money. That was a job for a 9-year-old, and it is the definition of a part worth nothing, because the only labor cheap enough to justify recovering it was a child on a summer afternoon. Then the cod went. Overfishing collapsed the stock. The Canadian government shut the fishery down in the early 90s, and tens of thousands of people lost their work in a single announcement. And the tongues became expensive. They sit on menus in good hotels and street johns now, priced as an appetizer, and you pay real money for the thing children used to pick out of a garbage heap. It is not the 140 times I opened with, but the direction of travel is identical, and the mechanism is that a part stays worthless only for as long as the animal it comes from is abundant. Number 8, getting them and cooking them. Ask your counter for cod cheeks and tongues together because they come off the same head, and anybody willing to cut one will cut the other. Say it plainly and without apology, because most fishmongers under 40 have never had the request and will need a second to place it, and then they will either say yes or tell you the heads leave whole with the frames, which is its own useful piece of information about where that shop sends its waste. If you are working from whole cod yourself, lay the head upside down, find the soft pocket under the jaw, and cut a shallow V. The tongue lifts out with a little tug. There is a thin membrane on one face that you can leave. The Newfoundland preparation is the right one, and it has not changed. Dredge them in seasoned flour, nothing wet, and fry them in pork fat for 2 or 3 minutes until the outside sets and goes gold. They are small, and they will overcook while you are looking at something else. And overcooked, they go from gelatinous to rubbery in a way there is no coming back from. The traditional finish is scruncheons, which are small pieces of salt pork rendered until crisp, scattered over the top with some of the fat they gave up. Salt, pepper, a squeeze of lemon if you want it, and nothing else. This is not a dish that improves with addition. Norway does the same thing with its own cod and calls them by a different name, which tells you the idea occurred independently to 2 sets of people who were cold, broke, and looking at a pile of heads. And there is one more thing in that head worth having while you are in there. The cheeks sit high on either side, behind the eye, and on a large cod they are the size of a scallop and eat like one. Any counter willing to cut you tongues will cut you cheeks in the same minute, and neither will appear on a price list, because neither has ever had a price. Number 9, milt, which I am going to describe accurately and then move past. Roe is the eggs from a female fish, and milt is the equivalent organ in the male, holding the sperm coming out as a pair of soft white lobes with a folded brain-like surface. Half the audience just made a face, and I am not going to pretend that is unreasonable, because I made the same face the first time somebody put a bowl of it in front of me in Boston. The Japanese name is shirako, which translates roughly as white children. It is a winter delicacy there. It appears on serious menus, and it is priced like one. Cod is the usual source, though it is also taken from salmon, monkfish, and pufferfish. What it eats like is nothing you would guess from the description. The texture is custard, closer to a set cream or a very soft cheese than to anything you would call fish, and the flavor is mild and faintly sweet with a clean finish. If you have eaten sea urchin and got on with it, this is the same neighborhood, and it is lighter and less insistent than monkfish liver. 2 preparations are worth knowing, and the plain one comes first. Blanch it briefly in salted water, chill it, and serve it cold in ponzu with scallion, which gives you the texture undisguised. The other is tempura, which means blanching first, then a thin batter, then oil at about 340 to 350 degrees until the coating turns pale gold. What happens inside that shell is that the milt goes molten, so bite it carefully the first time. Ask for it in winter from a counter that breaks down whole cod, and use the word milt rather than the Japanese one unless you know the shop. It will cost you nothing, which is now the 4th time in this list. Number 10. And here is the one that ruins everything else if you get it wrong. Every fish has a gallbladder. It is small, usually dark green or greenish brown, and it sits tucked against the liver near the front of the body cavity. It holds bile, and bile is the most bitter substance that will ever come out of an animal you are trying to eat. Rupture it and you have a problem no technique on this list solves. The bile spreads through the cavity, soaks into whatever it touches, and stains the flesh a yellow-green that does not wash out. Rinsing does not fix it, because the bitterness is not on the surface, it has gone in. Neither cooking nor salt touches it. You will taste it through butter, through batter, through a heavy sauce, and it will be the only thing anybody at the table remembers about the meal. So when you gut a fish, the order matters. Open the belly with the point of the knife rather than the edge, cutting shallow from vent toward head, so you are not driving a blade through organs you cannot see. Then find the liver and look at what is attached to it before you pull anything. The gall comes out with the liver intact, and only then do you clear the rest. If you are keeping the liver, separate the gall from it carefully over the bin rather than over the fish. And this is the answer to the timing question that people always ask about offal. Everything I have described today comes out of the fish in the first minutes, not the first hours. Organs break down faster than muscle does, and the gut carries enzymes and bacteria that go to work on everything they are touching the moment the animal is dead. A fish that sat whole and ungutted on a boat deck for 6 hours has liver you should not bother with and a roe sack that will not cure properly. That is why almost none of this is available in a supermarket. Not because it is illegal, and not because nobody wants it, because by the time that fish reached the case, the window had closed. Number 11, how to actually ask and when. Go on a delivery morning, because every shop takes fish on particular days, and the offal is gone or ruined by the afternoon of the same day, so a Saturday afternoon request gets you nothing but a shrug. Ask the person behind the glass which mornings the whole fish arrive, and go on one of those, then ask directly and by part. Not what do you do with the rest of it, which invites a vague answer, but whether they can save you the roe out of the mullet, or the liver off the monkfish, or the tongues and cheeks when they break down cod. Naming the part tells them immediately that you know what you are asking for, and it changes the conversation from a favor into an order. If they are filleting on site, ask them to hold what comes out rather than cut something fresh for you, which costs them nothing and is very often the difference between a yes and a no on a busy morning. Come back the following week whether or not it worked, because a face that turns up twice gets treated differently from a face that turns up once. Number 12, what they will and will not do, and why the answer is usually yes. Most of this is free or close to it, and not because anybody is being generous. It has no line on the price list, no code in the register, and no established value, so the path of least resistance is to hand it over in a bag and get back to the queue. I gave away roe and livers and frames for 34 years for exactly one reason, which is that ringing them up would have taken longer than giving them away. Somewhere in that arithmetic is the whole business. A shop hands you the part worth 140 times the flesh, free, in a plastic bag, because putting a number on it would have required somebody to stop and think. Where you will hit a wall is a shop that does not break down whole fish at all, which describes most supermarkets. If everything arrives pre-filleted in a box from a plant 3 states away, there are no organs on the premises and no amount of asking conjures them. The other refusal you may hear is about liability, and it is not unreasonable. Some shops will not hand over organs because there is no inspection regime attached to them the way there is to fillets. Take that answer at face value and go somewhere else rather than arguing. Number 13. Drying a bladder since I told you what one is worth and then left you holding it. Rinse it thoroughly first, inside and out, and strip off any membrane or clinging tissue, because whatever you leave on will spoil while the rest dries. Blanch it very briefly in hot water, which firms it and makes it easier to handle. Then flatten it out, either pressed between boards or pinned open, because an even thickness is the whole game, and a bladder left to dry in its natural shape dries at 3 different rates in 3 different places. Then it hangs in shade with air moving over it for several days until it goes hard and translucent and rattles against a fingernail. Store it dry and sealed, and it keeps effectively forever. Graded commercially, the thick, large ones command the money and the thin ones do not. Now, the honest part, and you were probably waiting for it, drying a bladder at home does not make you $500 a kilo. That price lives in a wholesale export market with buyers, graders, and relationships you do not have, and there is no counter in America where you can walk in and sell one. What you get instead is the ingredient, which you soak and simmer into soup and which carries a texture nothing else does. The number I gave you in the first minute of this video is a true number about what the world pays. It is not an income you can go and collect on Saturday. Number 14. Now the restrictions, and I would rather give you these than have you discover them. A lever is a filter and a store. It is where an animal parks what it has taken in over a lifetime, which is exactly why it tastes rich, and it is also why the contaminant load sits higher there than in the muscle beside it. That argues in one clear direction. Eat liver from small fish, young fish, fish low on the food chain and short-lived. Monkfish and cod sit comfortably inside that. A large, long-lived predator does not, and I would not be casual about it. Then there is vitamin A, which is a real thing rather than a caution somebody invented. Some fish store it in the liver at concentrations that will genuinely make a person ill, and shark and halibut liver are the two that turn up in the literature again and again with hospitalizations attached. The symptoms come on within hours, and they are unpleasant enough that the traditions in the far north have rules about which livers get eaten and which get buried. So take cod liver and monkfish liver and leave those two alone, and if you are pregnant or feeding small children, this is a category to skip rather than to negotiate with. The maw trade has a different problem, and it is one of identity rather than toxicity. A DNA survey of 503 dried maw samples in Singapore and Malaysia identified 39 different species in the pile, some of them critically endangered, with cheap bighead carp being sold as high-value croaker. Close to a third of the samples came from species nobody has properly assessed the conservation status of. That is a market where the buyers frequently do not know what they are buying, which is worth remembering the next time somebody quotes you a price for a dried bladder. Number 15. And here is what all of this adds up to, which is the thing my trade will like least. The fillet is the blandest tissue in the animal. That is not a provocation, it is a description of what muscle is. Lean protein arranged in sheets for moving a fish through water, carrying very little of what we actually respond to in food. The fat is somewhere else, and so is the collagen. And the glutamates that give a thing depth are concentrated in the organs and the connective tissue and the parts around the head, which is precisely the material that goes into the barrel. So the arrangement in every fish shop in this country is that the customer pays the highest price per pound for the least interesting part of the animal, and the parts carrying the flavor leave through the back door at 4 in the afternoon in a bin nobody has ever photographed. And notice that the flavor is not the only thing going out with them. The collagen that makes a stock set is in the frames and the skin. The vitamin D and the oil are in the liver. The parts we discard are not merely the tastier parts, they are the more nourishing ones, which is a strange sentence to have to say about a food culture that spends a great deal of money on supplements. I did exactly that. For 34 years, I stood at a bench and carried the interesting half of every fish that came through my hands out to a barrel by the loading door, and I did it cheerfully, and I did it because that was the shape of the business I had been handed at 19, and it never occurred to me to ask why. The men on the boats knew better, and every fishing culture that ever went hungry knew better, which is why the liver and the roe and the tongues and the bladder all carry names and traditions and preparations behind them in Japan and Newfoundland and Sardinia and Guangdong. None of that knowledge was lost. It simply stopped being ours, somewhere in the last century, when fish stopped being something you met and became something you bought in a rectangle. Let me give you all 15 in one breath. The bladder is worth 140 times the flesh around it. The top of that market is a crime and you stay out of it. Mullet roe cures into something worth $200 a pound. Salt it, press it, hang it for a month. The monkfish liver is a fifth of the saleable weight and most of ours leaves for Japan. Strip the vessels, salt, sake, roll, steam, and never soy. Cod tongues are a neck muscle that eats like a scallop. Flour, pork fat, 3 minutes. Milt is custard and you should try it once. Take the gall out whole or lose everything. Go on a delivery morning and ask by the part. Expect it free and expect some shops to have none. Dry a bladder flat in shade for days. Skip shark and halibut liver entirely. And understand that the fillet is the dullest thing in the animal. Now stand back and look at what these 6 parts have in common, because it is not that they are strange. Batarga was poor man's caviar. Cod tongues were cut out of garbage piles by 9-year-olds for pocket money. Monkfish liver went over the side of the boat before anybody bothered to bring it in. Fish maw was worthless until it was not. Every one of them was poverty food. Every one of them belonged to the people who had no choice but to eat the parts nobody wanted, and every one of them became expensive at the exact moment somebody with money noticed, and the ones who ate it first got priced out of it. That pattern is not confined to fish, and once you see it, you will find it everywhere. Chicken wings were stock material or waste until a bar in Buffalo did something with them in the 60s. Oxtail and brisket and skirt steak sat at the cheap end of a meat counter within living memory, bought by people who could not afford anything better, and there is not one of them you can call cheap today. The mechanism runs the same way each time. A part is discarded. Somebody poor works out how to make it delicious. The technique escapes into a wider market, and then the price closes the door behind it. So the useful thing is not to arrive at the end of that sequence, paying the price a name has acquired. It is to be near the beginning of the next one, which in practice means looking at what your own counter is throwing away this week rather than waiting several years for a menu somewhere to inform you that it was valuable all along. A woman came into my shop in the 90s and asked, in an accent I could not place, for the swim bladders and nothing else. I gave them to her free every week for years, and I never once asked her what she did with them, because I assumed there was nothing to ask about. She was the only person in that entire building who understood what was in the barrel. So tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and whether any of these 6 were ordinary in the house you grew up in. And if there is a part of a fish your family ate that I have not named here, put it down, because those are the ones I read twice, and there are a great many more than 15. Next time, I am going to show you how to turn the parts nobody wants into fish sauce in a jar on a shelf, using a method the Romans ran as an industry and which almost nobody in this country has attempted. It takes months and it takes almost no work. There is exactly one number you have to get right. And if you get it wrong, you do not get fish sauce, you get rot. And I will show you that number before anything else.